You would think that all these years we would have found out a way to functionally press the pause button on the economy.
One of the topics that I consistently revisit on this channel is the hubris behind economic planning. One of the points that I don't think I emphasize enough is that there are multiple ways in which the government can engage in planning. The most obvious kind of planning was that of the Soviet Union, where virtually every output was determined through bureaucratic fiat. This is the most rigid form of planning, and it has consistently produced the worst results. There are softer forms of planning, though, where the government often works through conduits. I would include any form of price fixing in this, whether it's literal price controls or tariffs or subsidies or anything of that nature. I would argue that this form of planning is harmful, but it's not as impactful as central planning. That said, its adherents do suffer from the same conceit: the belief that they can achieve better outcomes than markets. That is to say, they think they can get better economic results using the tools of public policy than can people freely exchanging with one another. I've also said that people often show their hand with the analogies they use for the economy. Planners, by the way, economic planners exist all over the political spectrum, are particularly fond of comparing the economy to a machine. Even the most complex machines can be taken apart, fixed, repurposed, redirected, and so forth, as long as the person or group of people working on that machine have the right knowledge and expertise. My absolute favorite economy as a machine analogy came from our boy Kyle Kulinski. When the economic fallout associated with COVID-19 first started happening, which it's hard to believe was almost exactly 3 years ago now, Kyle declared that we needed an economic pause button.
You would think that all these years we would have found out a way to functionally press the pause button on the economy. Like the stock market, you know how the stock market automatically shuts off when it drops too fast? When it looks like there's going to be a run on the banks? Everything just shuts off. So can't we have effectively a pause button for the broader economy where only the essential businesses stay open, all the others are closed, and everybody basically stays home, and then you have the emergency procedures go into effect, the emergency processes go into effect, where, like I said, it's a freeze on the major bills, you get the automatic allowance to pay for the non-essential bills. You know, when I say that, I mean whatever, your food, Netflix, whatever you're doing during this time of crisis, internet, like the major bills should be paused. Certain ones, you know, obviously won't be, but I think that's the only way to really get through this and weather the storm. But unfortunately, what you're seeing is we have no provisions in place to do an effective lockdown. So the economy, like the market's still open and everything just kind of immediately plummets and crashes, which leads to more pain and more desperation.
Obviously, Kyle does not literally believe there should be a button that pauses the economy. He wants some set of emergency policies to be enacted when the economy experiences some sort of calamity. Is Kyle onto something here? Could you, in effect, pause the economy? Well, when you first think about it, it doesn't seem too crazy. I mean, a number of businesses essentially pause all economic activity 2 days a week. You know, the weekend. When Monday rolls around, they more or less pick up right where they left off. We also know that, in the summertime, much of Europe goes on vacation. While I've never been there, from what I've heard, large swaths of the economy are essentially shut down, and as far as I know, they don't have too much trouble getting back online when the holiday season is over. Also, we know that economic statistics are almost always seasonally adjusted because certain parts of the economy just don't function at certain times of the year. For example, where I live, you don't have too many lifeguards this time of year. I think you know why. So this idea of partially shutting down the economy while we ride out the virus wasn't that far out there, at least as some people saw it. For example, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers was initially optimistic about an economic shutdown and a quick rebound afterwards. A V-shaped recovery, as it's often called. You shut things down because of the virus, then when the virus passes or we get a vaccine or whatever, you start it back up like nothing happened. It's like restarting your computer when it's acting up. As Summers told Vanity Fair, he believed that shutting down the economy and then starting it back up again would be akin to the character of the recovery from the total depression that hits the Cape Cod economy every winter, or the recovery in American GDP that takes place every Monday morning. This was more or less the idea that was behind the initial lockdowns and the COVID relief programs. There was never any national lockdown in the United States. Arguably, the federal government never had the authority to do that, even if President Trump had wanted to, but the CDC did issue guidelines, and most states followed suit. The only states that didn't issue lockdowns were North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, Arkansas, and Utah. Those are some of the least densely populated states in the country, so I'm assuming their logic was that statewide lockdowns were unnecessary. Even in these states, though, there were still some mandatory school and business closings, as well as some local lockdowns. So it's not like there was some widespread let-it-rip strategy out there in the country when the pandemic first started. Furthermore, the federal government took unprecedented steps to keep people afloat during the lockdown period. Obviously, the government sent out COVID stimulus checks. First, there were $12,000 checks in April of 2020, then $600 checks in December of 2020, and $1,400 checks in March of 2021. There were also the enhanced unemployment benefits that the federal government gave out. On top of state unemployment benefits, people received an additional $600 a week for 13 weeks, under the CARES Act. There was also student loan forbearance, PPP loans to businesses that were forgiven, as long as the businesses kept enough people on their payroll, an extended child tax credit, mortgage and rent relief, billions of dollars in guaranteed loans to large businesses in important sectors like the airline industry, and a number of tax benefits, such as waiving the penalty on early 401k withdrawal. Overall, relative to the size of its economy, the United States was one of the most generous countries in terms of benefits. As the Washington Post reports, the U.S. fiscal response in 2020 was among the largest in the world. It was comparable to, or slightly smaller than, the responses in a few other countries like Germany and Canada, but roughly the same, said Jason Furman, a senior Obama administration official. The fiscal response in 2021 so far in the United States is massively larger than what any other country has done to date or is currently discussing. As a percentage of GDP, the US is second only to Japan in terms of relief, according to an analysis by Turkish economist Ceyhun Elgin. Apologies for butchering your name, sir. Japan is number one in terms of value of its relief programs at 54.9% of their GDP, though some dispute that number, as the Japanese government included things in their relief packages that were not directly related to COVID spending, such as a fund that promotes carbon-neutral projects. It's also worth noting that many citizens in other wealthy, industrialized nations got benefits through their pre-existing social safety net. These countries often have more generous safety nets than the United States does, but are not necessarily counted in every single analysis. So this skews the numbers as well. This whole thing isn't exactly easy to measure, but with all that said, this parochial view that I oftentimes run into online, that the United States hardly did anything for its citizens in terms of relief, simply isn't true. Once you add together all of the relief packages, over $5 trillion was spent by the federal government. To put that number into perspective, in terms of inflation-adjusted dollars, the United States spent $4 trillion on World War II. A plurality of the COVID relief went directly to individuals, whereas a healthy portion of it went to businesses and governments, though those usually served as conduits to individuals. The PPP loans are a great example of this. What's more is that these relief efforts were more or less made in an attempt to pause the economy, so to speak. The federal government, over the course of 2 administrations, attempted to prop up both the demand and supply sides of the economy so that, once the virus passed or herd immunity was reached, we could start the machine back up. As the New York Times reported, what the money did was basically to make sure that when we could reopen, people had money to spend, their credit rating wasn't ruined, they weren't evicted, and kids weren't going hungry, said Louise Shiner, an economist with the Brookings Institution. It is a lesson that if you don't want a recession to have really long-lasting bad effects, you spend a bunch of money to prevent it. I know a lot of people fell through the cracks and got hassled when attempting to get their COVID benefits. And I know that some people think that the benefits were not nearly as robust as they should have been, and that the lockdowns weren't nearly as long or restrictive as they should have been. There are still some people, believe it or not, who think that we should still be in lockdown. But no one can say, in the face of these numbers, that a genuine effort wasn't made. In other words, the government authorities in the United States did try to pause the economy. And while certain numbers may suggest that we are in fact recovering, the V-shaped rebound we were hoping for didn't materialize. A closer examination of the details suggests that this was never going to happen. As Ryan A. Bourne writes in Economics in One Virus, with contractual relationships, impacts on workers' productivity, changes to how businesses can operate, deadlines for suppliers, and ongoing changed behavior or enforced regulations on customers, simply picking up where you left off was not an option. As I've discussed in previous videos, human behavior in response to COVID-19 was necessarily going to change, irrespective of what the government did or didn't do. Even after states started to lift lockdowns, consumers were still cautious about engaging in economic activity that requires face-to-face interaction. As Bourne writes, despite a strong pickup in retail sales after reopening, overall U.S. consumer spending was still down 5% on August 31st, 2020, relative to January 2020, after falling below 32% of January's level on March 30th. In other words, despite bouncing back sharply, overall spending was still below the pre-pandemic level by a significant recession-like magnitude, and nowhere near back where it would have been had the pandemic never occurred. In more granular spending categories, there were relatively sharp rebounds in spending on clothing and merchandise after reopenings, as well as healthcare. But transportation use, restaurant, and hotel spending remained very depressed, while grocery store spending stayed elevated. All of these data are suggestive of people having continued to stay home more than usual, even after lockdowns were lifted. The pandemic didn't end just as some restrictions were lifted. Now, some people may look at this and conclude that this is proof that lockdowns should have been longer, and benefits more generous along with them. In my opinion, however, this just goes to show that the attempts to control human behavior are folly, and that blanket policies that affect everyone are misguided, as everyone has different levels of risk they're willing to tolerate. Even if you put policies in place that attempt to pause the economy, that machine isn't necessarily going to start right up when you tell it to. Decreased demand for in-person activities had its own consequences on demand as well. For example, businesses that rely on in-person consumption, restaurants, sports stadiums, concert halls, and so forth, were facing a lot of uncertainty after restrictions were eased. These businesses faced a lot of questions. Were restrictions going to be reinstated at some point? And even if they weren't, how many people would actually brave the conditions and show up? Would they have workers to staff their place, even if there was demand for their product or service? Businesses in this position were very reluctant to make large capital investments, which leaves the suppliers of these businesses in an uncertain place too, and down the line it goes. As Bourne writes, there's the risk that your suppliers, or those you supply, will be affected by disruption or a forced shutdown, too, either in the United States or abroad. This itself will deter risky investment. Why replace those inefficient industrial dryers in your dry cleaning business without knowing when or if your key local hotel customers might reopen and use your services? This just goes to show that you can't neatly divide the economy into supply side and demand side. After all, a lot of suppliers have demand for somebody else's product. There's also the problem of scale. If the federal government is involved in handing out hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars, you're necessarily going to have to deal with some level of misallocation. The federal government is necessarily unable to closely scrutinize where every dollar goes. Hence, if your goal is to keep people employed and to maintain our supply side infrastructure, guaranteed loans that are forgiven on the condition that the company keeps its payroll intact is, at best, a blunt instrument. Harvard economist Raj Shetty, I apologize for mispronouncing your name as well, along with a team of economists, analyzed COVID relief programs for the National Bureau of Economic Research. They argued that PPP loans were relatively ineffective at keeping employment levels stable. Specifically, the sectors that experienced the biggest losses were some of the least likely to get the loans. As Chidi and his team ask in their paper, how did COVID-19 and stabilization policies affect spending and employment? Why did the PPP have small effects on employment rates? One potential explanation is that the loans were taken by firms that intended not to lay off many employees to begin with. That is, firms that were inframarginal recipients of loans. Consistent with this, Granja and others show that states and congressional districts that experienced more job losses prior to April 3rd actually received fewer PPP loans. Moreover, PPP loans also were not distributed to the industries most likely to experience job losses from the COVID crisis. For example, firms in the professional, scientific, and technical services industry received a greater share of the PPP loans than accommodation and food services. Yet, accommodation and food services accounted for half of the total decline in employment between February and March, prior to PPP enactment, in BLS statistics, while employment in professional, scientific, and technical services accounted for less than 5% of the decline. For the most part, companies with fewer than 500 employees were the only ones eligible for PPP loans. One exception to this rule was the food service industry. The logic behind this was to aid franchisees of larger fast food companies. In other words, despite the fact that more restaurants were eligible for loans than were businesses in other sectors of the economy, the food service industry received fewer loans than did most other sectors. Again, Chetty and his team do not have a definitive answer as to why this is, but I believe that politicians and bureaucrats, the ones in charge of allocating these loans, oftentimes act out of their narrow political self-interests. which are not always congruent with the economic interests of the country as a whole. I believe that could be a factor. Of course, misallocation of funds can come in many forms, including the propping up of companies that really shouldn't be around anymore. Economic churn is always happening in a relatively free economy such as the United States. Markets were always going to respond to a disruptive event like COVID-19, irrespective of what the government did. If the government is bailing out companies just so that they can keep their employees, there's the possibility that the government kept alive businesses that probably should fail or at least change due to shifting circumstances. As Bourne writes, the problem with trying to preserve the economy of March 2020 is that the virus has brought substantial permanent or semi-permanent alterations in behavior or tastes. Then subsidizing businesses to protect existing jobs could have proved to be a drag on some aspects of the recovery. As the economy woke up to new realities in a changed world, we'd want workers and capital to be reallocated to where they are most productive as quickly as possible. Programs that delayed or disincentivized this reallocation, from subsidies to regulations, would then become extremely costly. Think about the airline industry again. As economist Chad Syverson has pointed out, if we don't fly as often post-pandemic, then the capital value of aircraft will plunge, irrespective of any government bailout. Hotels in certain locations might not be viable, even with government support. We will no doubt see a raft of companies that tried to cling on in the hope that consumer demand would come roaring back, or that a vaccine would save the day, but which nevertheless don't survive. Government programs will have kept a large number of zombie companies alive that will not be viable in the socially distanced world. Think about it this way. When the pandemic was in full force, we got increased demand for the products of certain businesses. Demand for masks and other forms of PPE increased dramatically, and companies like Zoom, Netflix, and Peloton saw increased interest as well due to people changing their behavior. As the pandemic has waned, so too has interest in a lot of these products and companies. People changed their behavior, and what these companies were offering just wasn't as appealing as it was earlier. It's hard to imagine anyone arguing that we ought to subsidize these companies so that they can continue to produce at the level they were during the pandemic. But that almost certainly happened with certain companies pre-pandemic. I have no doubt that PPP loans helped certain companies ride out the few years when demand went down for them. That said, in some ways, the world changed permanently in 2020. And more than likely, we've subsidized certain companies that have not changed along with it. Shoveling resources into companies that are no longer producing something of value is bad economic policy. There are other ways in which pausing the economy really isn't a realistic option, but we'll have to save those for another time. If you want a more thorough examination of this idea, I suggest you look into the book Economics in One Virus by Ryan A. Bourne. There's a reason why I cited him so much in this video. For now, though, I want to return to where we started, the idea of economic planners and their hubris. A couple of weeks ago, Sam Cedar said this about the lab leak theory versus natural origin theory, but it applies to virtually every facet of COVID, and even beyond that.
The reason why the right attacks the idea of things like a virus existing in nature is because it both points to like the potential problems with climate change. It also said, like, if you accept that nature presents something like this, as opposed to it being a nefarious plot, that you could stop the plot. If you were stronger or more,
send the cops in.
militaristic, send the cops in, whatever it is. But if you accept that these things exist outside of being able to preempt them, then you have to accept that the only response is a communal one. And the problem with a communal response to a pandemic is not the specific communal response to a pandemic, but it begins to make it clear on an almost an ideological level that communal responses can work, that we need government. We need a society that is actually can marshal forces that individuals or corporations cannot marshal.
He's probably onto something. We're all guided about by motivated reasoning, which is exactly why you could just as easily turn this on him. I already think he's making a leap by suggesting that COVID necessitates a communal, by which he means government, response. That's how he and his ilk look at most things. By supporting lockdowns and relief efforts, are they not trying to set a precedent as well? Of course, you'll notice that he left himself some wiggle room there. It's not about the specific response to the pandemic, it's about a communal response per se. This way, he doesn't have to own the negative aspects of the relief programs and lockdowns, of which there are many. He can just squirm out of it by saying that they didn't do collectivism correctly. You may have noticed an emerging narrative about how true lockdowns were never tried. I think that's pretty weak tea. The online left called for a collective response to the pandemic, and we got one.
And I'll tell you what, you've never seen a stronger argument for an intelligent, coordinated central authority than a pandemic. Never seen it this strong of an argument before. Because what you absolutely need in a crisis like this is efficient, competent leaders who are coordinating.
The government took drastic action and mobilized tons of resources. Did the pandemic response look exactly the way the online left thought it should? Probably not. But that doesn't mean that we didn't take drastic action, and that there aren't important lessons to be learned for government responses in general. I get that lockdowns aren't the most evergreen topic, but they weren't some one-off. They were a massive experiment in collectivism. Exactly the sort of collectivism that the left wants to make routine.